This is a facsimile of something known as the Aitken's Bible, a Bible published by Robert Aitken in 1782 that was also approved and recommended by the United States Congress itself. Now, times have certainly changed. We likely wouldn't see the Congress approve and recommend a Bible today, but the Aitken's Bible remains a landmark in the United States' confusing founding, a founding that still perplexes many Catholics today. We've been talking about this a lot on Catholic Family News recently, and I wanted to start with an introduction to the American founding and the Catholic perspective on viewing it from an interview that I've recently done with Ryan Grant. I'm sure you've seen this nowadays, but oftentimes when it's monarchism and republicanism is brought up, St. Robert Bellarmine is mentioned, and I've seen him often used to defend the American political system. They'll say, well, this is actually the American foundation is quite close to what St. Robert Bellarmine would have wanted. Do you think, of course you can't speak for Bellarmine, but do you think that St. Robert Bellarmine would have approved for how the American political system was set up? And what in general were his political beliefs?
Well, Bellarmine was not a political philosopher. For him, all things were in service of theology. So the only reason he delves into politics at all, one would have been when he was taking his degrees to deal with politics and Aristotle, and two, to deal with the Anabaptists, who denied all political authority as such, that there could be such all political authority is evil and wrong and by necessity servitude. And he is anti-authoritarian as I am. I don't go quite so far, but because it's contrary to Scripture, among other things. So one of the things that happens in defending that, then he has to delve into the origins of political authority. And really all he's doing is repeating St. Thomas. All he's doing is repeating, other authors. There's nothing particularly. If you want to get to good political theorists, you really should go to Suarez because he fleshes all this stuff out. Bellarmine's largely just giving a principle, and he's laying down the nature of political authority. And so this term is used to describe a popular sovereignty, that is, the origin of political authority, which is ultimately when people live together in society, there has to be some rule or government or plan by which people are organized. And so the people will transfer their right to a ruler or system of rule of some kind. And then once that transfer has been made, as far as Bellarmine's concerned, they don't, they become true subjects now. They no longer have the right to take it back and just change it. But he does that. It seems, though, that since political authority originated with the people, that for just and grave reasons, they can take it back. So later on, when he gets in his pamphlet war with King James, he actually retreats from that position and lays it out very clear. All I wanted to do was deal with the origin of political authority. I did not mean to sanction rebellion. I mentioned other authors, but I didn't necessarily approve of them. I was just citing opinions that were out there. And he makes it positively clear to King James. Once the people have given up, established the edifice of the political structure of the state, then, truly like substance and accident, the people are to the ruler. And so they are the people and he's the ruler. And there's no way to change that. Except probably for just and grave reasons, but he wouldn't admit rebellion, at least whether that was just for the purposes of arguing James or he was backtracking altogether on the notion of it, unclear. And the things that they're talking about are in a completely different world from what later 18th century discussions in the United States or in France are about. And so when you look closely at I wrote actually a series of articles that Catholic Family News has on their website. You want to get more in detail with this. I call it the Bellarmine Jefferson legend, of course, this myth that Jefferson read all this Bellarmine, or he read it cited in Robert Filmer's Patriarcha and said, wow, this Bellarmine guy is right. And it inspired him to write the Declaration of Independence. It's completely false. It's nonsensical. It rests on pure conjecture. It's an idea created by the Jesuits back around the turn of the 20th century. Around the same time, they created the George Washington conversion myth, which again is another myth that rests upon zero testimony and zero evidence, and a witness testimony from 150 years later or 120, whatever it was at the time. None of it's plausible, but there's a purpose to it, especially for the Jesuits in Georgetown, and there's because you have American Catholicism in the person of, say, Dagger John, of Bishop John Hughes of New York. It's this militant, and I don't mean physically militant, but spiritually militant. We are going to convert the whole world. We're going to convert the Congress and the armed forces and the president to the Catholic faith and be a true Catholic republic. We're going to convert Europe. We're going to convert Britain. We're going to convert all the nations. Catholicism, as Hughes says, will conquer all nations. And then you got people who are a little bit embarrassed by that, like Bishop Ireland in St. Paul, Minnesota. And he's very embarrassed by the fact. He's embarrassed by parochial schooling. He's embarrassed by the idea that Catholics would dare to stand out from this great American experiment, which they should all be part of. Now, it's one thing to love your country, be patriotic, and also recognizing your country's flaws is also patriotic in as much as which is the right of a citizen to recognize the flaws in his country. And there's this attitude, well, you don't like it, go to England, go wherever. What about making our country better? You know, I don't want to jump into the hyper anti-Americanism and at least in terms of its foundation or its notion or the land that gave us birth anyway. I don't want to jump into that. But to get it really truly, Catholics are in a certain sense, foreigners as they are in the entire world. And, the United States is not a Catholic nation. So you look at Bellarmine again in the rest of the treatise where he enunciates these various political principles, De Laicis. And the last chapter of the book is on the need to burn heretical books and suppress freedom of speech. So American, who would have thought?
Right. Yes.
Jefferson ever vented. He would have got to that part and said, well, enough of these stuffy Jesuits. We're not doing that. It just doesn't work. And the whole notion of, the church is like the three branches of government, and you have the church, and you have bishops, and you have cardinals, because Bellarmine lays out an argument, which is an argument for monarchy in the very opening chapters of On the Roman Pontiff. Like the first 7 chapters or so are on monarchy is the best system of government, and why democracy is positively the worst, and republicanism mixed and usually ineffectual. And then he goes further, because in his point is Calvin earlier on argued that republicanism was the best form of government and aristocracy, not monarchy. And so, and that's, of course, to support his notions of presbyters' councils, who, together, exercise the power over the word of God. And they exercise for Calvin a sort of magisterium. They're the ones who bind you to the interpretation, understanding of the word of God. The idea of, like you say, like you're Baptist, you're fundamentalist, that said, oh, just me and my Bible. Calvin would have had nothing to do with that position. He would have anathematized you. That's not, the notion of the teaching office of the church as far as Calvin understands it. But it's the presbyters' councils, which is why he has to argue for aristocracy being the best form of government, which puts him at odds with the entirety of the tradition, from not just from the Greeks, but also the church fathers and everything else. And so Bellarmine responds again by showing monarchy is the best system of government. But because the conditions of this world would not allow for a pure and unmixed monarchy, you have to have a mixed form of government, or as I translated there, a tempered form of government. So you have monarchy that is tempered with aristocracy, and likewise tempered with democracy. And that would be, according to the ancients, there's some elements of each system in the whole monarchy. And that, therefore, is the church, he says. So that, that you have the monarch who's truly the king. He is where the buck stops, as it were, to employ the modern parlance. And then you have, the bishops, who are true aristocrats, in a sense that they are true, like lords and owners of their temporal see. And then you have the element of democracy, which is anyone can be drawn up into any of these offices from the Christian people. And of course, obviously, yes, he means men, average men laboring away, and you have popes who came from very poor backgrounds, not a whole ton, especially during various periods of the church, but more recently, St. Pius X was a farm boy from a very poor family. And just by his holiness and virtue and God's grace in an election, rose until he was cardinal archbishop and then elected pope. So that is one of the, the ways that the democracy, the democratic element enters the church, is that anybody can be part of this aristocratic and monarchical system. But a monarchy, the pope is only one judge, and that's God. So the United States employs a different system, which which is basically modeled on English law, and is basically reinventing England. So we have a revolution from England by recreating England. to be more suitable to the local elites over here rather than over there. Or as one historian puts it, Americans took on heavy taxes to finance their war against taxation without representation, and never paid taxes as low as they did prior to the revolution. And the author is pro-revolution, by the way, but he's just noted it's a fact of history. We paid fewer taxes prior to the American Revolution than after. And so what's the raison d'etre of it? And it's essentially the notion of local elites in Virginia, in the House of Burgess, in New England, that we can run the country better than the Parliament over there. And on top of that, you have King George, who's trying to undo as much as he can the Revolution of 1689, the so-called Glorious Revolution. Mm-hmm. And that made Parliament supreme. And the king is trying to and then his heirs, King George, who was German, didn't want anything to do with the rule of England. And even before him, William of Orange, when he's William III, they have to give concessions, Dutch holdings around the world, the power of the king in this realm or in this one is concessions to Parliament for Parliament to grant new taxes and levies of troops to go fight William's wars and later Anne's and then George's against the French in the continent. And so power of the English monarch goes down and is very weak. George III is the first monarch since Anne that spoke English as a first language. And it was because George the First and George the Second, they always spoke German. They refused to speak English. George III speaks it fluently, and he considers himself properly speaking English rather than Hanoverian. It's a new thing for the Georges. And he wants to recover a lot of this power. So, and that's the genesis essentially for the American Revolution. Not slavery, not not merely taxes. Those are occasions and flashpoints, and they do create grievances, especially the nature like the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is something that makes sense in a lot of areas in England. It makes zero sense in New England. But when Parliament's trying to find ways to pay for the 7 Years' War, which protected American colonists, they're like, well, we need a new tax. Oh, let's come up with this. They come up with this idiotic idea, the Stamp Act, and let's impose it in a place with lawyers and clerks where they abound, and everyone uses paper. They now pay tax on paper to the crown. It's a really dumb idea. George heard the colonists were upset about it, and he told his men in Parliament to have the Stamp Act withdrawn. Now, if we are upset about a tax and the president hears about it, how often is the president working to undo those taxes? That doesn't actually happen.
No.
Now, to extol, England as this wonderful place, and I mean, the defeat of George's policies then over here are also the defeat of his policies in England. And England would probably look a lot different if that hadn't happened, but it did. And that's a fact. And better or worse, that's our country. And the United States, it is our country. And again, we should wish to make it better. And we're not going to undo that revolution. So just to put that out there. But just, laying out these kind of facts. Now, what would Bellarmine think? Based on Bellarmine's political philosophy, the naked facts of so many of these things, I don't think he would consider those just reasons for revolution. But once you get to the Treaty of Ghent and the English crown acknowledges the independence of the 13 colonies, from that point on, and they establish a government, and the government is received and accepted by the people, and then endures, Bellarmine would consider that a legitimate government. So based on all the principles they laid down. But was the United States a Catholic, creation? No, it wasn't. I mean, the principles are far more current in Protestant thinking than they are in Catholic. And especially because you're talking about the direct representation. Popular sovereignty in Bellarmine and Suarez does not mean voting. It does not mean everyone gets to go vote in elections, because Bellarmine's not a Republican. He's a monarchist. It just means that the origin of political authority comes from the people itself, because the object of the monarch's rule is to provide, peace and tranquility for the people so they can acquire the goods and services necessary to raise up children in the church and get them to heaven and get themselves to heaven. That's ultimately the monarch's job, is to provide peace and security in the realm for the people. His position exists for the people, not like in King James I's absolutist notion, his patriarchal notion in his book On the Law of Free Monarchy, where James argues 100% for absolutist rule that, well, the king's got, the king's being a king is like a sacramental system. It's like a sacrament, and it exists for its own purpose to be king. And thus the king can only be judged by God, not by the Pope, not by the people. and that's flies in the face. I mean, just look at St. Thomas, and that flies in the face of St. Thomas Aquinas. So, I mean, Theodore Beza and Calvin, and during the English Civil War, the Levelers, the New Model Army, Cromwell, all these people who are the Algernon Sidney, John Locke, they would have all been very surprised to hear that they held to an essentially Catholic system. It's just the common current of the notions of European government. There's nothing particularly special about it. And so Bellarmine, would have, again, if you transported him up to 1776 and you gave him the bare facts of it, he might not find the cause, just per se, at least on those principles. He might support it for other reasons, like, hey, there's a lot of Catholics on the side of the revolution. There's also Catholic loyalists that fight on the side of the crown too. So, but once the Treaty of Ghent happens, he'd call that a legit country. And so that's kind of the reality of that situation. There's like, it comes from that Jesuit tradition in the 19th century. We got to find a place for Catholics at the American table, not we need to convert the American table to being a Catholic table. So that the notion of what America is something that in and of itself is good, and we need to take our place within it as good citizens by not rocking the boat. And that's the view that wins out with people like Henry Lloyd George, Monsignor Kenneth Ryan, Father Courtney Murray. That's their view. Essentially, is America is something that is in and of itself good, not a nation to be converted. And that's not to say that all the old crowns of Europe are those wonderful Catholic countries are really our model, because I mean, especially since the French Revolution, they've all been models of disorder and problem. And so you look at Spain now, you look at Italy now, you look at France now. We're not going to turn around and say, well, America sucks because it's not Christendom. They're in a bad way too. We all are. And so ultimately, there's freedoms in this country that I enjoy. I had a chance to go back to Italy, and I probably would have done it just for the food and the culture alone. But there's certainly, there's a trade-off. There's certain rights. This is my homeland, one. Even though at least at the time I had this option, I spoke Italian pretty fluently. Now it's dropped a bit because I don't keep it up. I can read in it, but speaking takes a while to get back into. But just the same, there's certain things. Right now I'm carrying a pistol. In Europe, I could not do that. Right. And so even in Switzerland, where they have large gun rights, I would walk. I mean, nobody does it. It's that's something that's particularly an American right. And then, other freedoms we have, then there's other things that don't work so well. So you got to say, all right, well, I have these trade-off of goods going from this country to this one. Does that make Italy better? There's a lot of ways in which Italy is worse. And there's some things that makes it better. There's a lot of ways when America's better and some things that makes it worse. Ultimately, it's still my homeland. It's where I was born, and I'm an American. And living over, if I lived somewhere else, when I did live over there, I was an American living in Italy. I was not an Italian. So that's just reality. So I just wanted to put that out there. So when I talk about these things, it's not hate on America. It's not America's evil. It's not go back to England. We've got to go back to England. It's like no, none of that. It's here. But
no, absolutely. And I think I think what you're saying is very realist, and it shows the great deal of historical nuance that's required to actually speak on these issues. There's quite a lot going into them. So that's a great thank you for laying that out, and I agree with your assessment on that. I recently had the opportunity to get a different perspective on the American founding from an Englishman, Connor Tomlinson. To my surprise, when I asked him this question, he sort of turned it on its head and gave a traditionalist defense of the American founding. Here's that for you. You mentioned that the expression of the popular expression of Catholicism is so tied in with the English political tradition. Something I wanted to ask you about that is, we, of course, as Americans, it's this eternal struggle of trying to figure out how we can balance being Americans and loving our country, knowing that it was founded on Freemasonry and liberal principles with, of course, traditional Catholicism. I think there's a similarity when it comes to England and the United Kingdom because of how much John Locke and John Stuart Mill have had their influence on the English political tradition. Do you find that there is a similar struggle that Englishmen have to make in order to find how their Catholicism harmonizes with their identity as Englishmen?
Oh, I love how loaded that question is. So I'll separate the
Oh,
Americans. I've got things to say about the American tradition actually, because it greatly disappoints me that lots of American conservatives have kind of relinquished the founding creation myth to being that of secular liberalism,
mm,
because of course the founding fathers didn't establish a national church. This is despite the Federalists wanting to do so, but obviously the sort of Jeffersonians ran out of time. But the phrase liberal democracy is not found in any of the documents until well after the Second World War. Even FDR was talking about Christian democracy. Again,
mm.
that underlying moral substrata. Yes, they were Protestants, God bless them. Which I have my thoughts on how that led ineluctably to secular liberalism, but I'll pipe that for a minute there. But the idea that you can decouple the American founding from the Christian faith is broadly impossible, because when they said freedom of religion, they basically meant freedom of Christian denomination. And we know this because John Adams,
Fair.
the man who said, our constitution is meant for moral and religious people, the one time that he said that America is not a Christian nation was when negotiating with the Muslim Barbary pirates, because he had to sort of lie his way into getting them on the same negotiating terms. But that
Mhm.
certainly isn't how it was practiced. Yes, of course, you had Ben Franklin and the likes, and you had deism, which was a lot more of a mechanistic way of viewing things than theism. But obviously, Christianity informed the American founding. Now, looking at England, I mean, the problem we have now with Locke and Mill is that liberalism is an ideology. So Michael Oakeshott said that ideologies are kind of abstractions of a particular tradition from a time and place to then be made universal, as if you can pick it up and just drop it anywhere, right? And so liberalism is how the English people historically thought of themselves, exported to non-Englishmen. This is why America had a liberal founding, but it was all founded by Christian Englishmen who just thought, of course, all men are created free and equal. We think this is self-evident because all we know are Christian Englishmen. They didn't really think that people with incompatible traditions and faiths would arrive on their shores and fundamentally change the character and interpretation of the Constitution. And so what we've got since then, because of the rise of the American hegemony, specifically after the Second World War, where they displaced the British Empire as the predominant power, is we've got a folding back of liberalism on top of England, with a sort of American institutionalism and a constitutionalism where we didn't have it before. And so now we've got the liberal tradition grating against the English tradition. And it's kind of like coming home to see someone wearing the skin of your wife and demanding that they love you. It's not quite like, you kind of look like my wife, but you don't really sound and act like her. And there's something off here. And I think what we're beginning to see in English political discourse is the seams of where it doesn't quite meet up.
Interesting. You in your commentary there on the American founding, you talked about really how it's Christian democracy broadly. You've got different denominations coming together. I think there's a parallel today with the rise of what is it's an ill-defined term, but Christian nationalism. Uh, do you see a problem with traditional Catholics having to unite with non-Catholics in order to bring about their political goals? Because what's coming to mind is, of course, the political movements of the early 20th century and the 19th century. You can look in France, Action Française, for example. These movements that eventually they had major problems with them. Do you see Christian nationalism as something that we should embrace, or something that we should be cautious of?
So I know the anti-woke coalition, which is kind of operating like a post-Cold War version of fusionism at the moment, where you have sort of Catholic conservatives and secular liberals allied against what they think woke is, even though they can't really define it on shared terms. Um, that that is so that coalition is it's fractioning in the same way that they will over the trans issue, with the sort of trans exclusionary radical feminists over Christian nationalism, because what the secular liberals think is that you can confine all public conceptions of the good to the private sphere, whereas the people who are either Christian nationalists or ones who aren't afraid of it recognize that there is no such thing as neutrality on moral concerns. If you confine one conception of moral goods to the private sphere, then you allow its antonym to also coexist with it and slowly destroy it. So you are actually taking a proactive moral position. You just have the sort of presumptive arrogance that you can contain both incompatible conceptions within the same thing. multiculturalism operates the same way in Britain. You have an established church, but then you also import loads of Islamists, and suddenly we're celebrating Ramadan over Easter. So anyway, parking that. Christian nationalism, I don't know if you've read William Wolf's book, or Stephen Wolf rather, because William and Stephen are both in this movement. But Stephen Wolf's book, Christian nationalism, I could never call myself Christian nationalist. And I think Yoram Hazony does a really good thing in Conservatism and Rediscovery, saying why Christian nationalism makes sense for America. Because it is an Americanism. Because America is a propositional nation, whereas England is like an old world nation. But again, we don't have an explicit constitution, but that explicit constitution is not liberal. It's actually founded on Christian suppositions. So to be a Christian nationalist does make sense for Americans. I just don't see Stephen Wolf's version of it rising anytime soon, because he does essentially call for a Christian prince or a kind of Caesar figure, sort of Roman Republic clause that says in times of crisis we can have a temporary dictator. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens accidentally, given the upcoming elections. So with Christian nationalism, I neither identify with it nor am I worried about it. But it's not quite the aberration to the American tradition as a lot of anti-woke liberals would have people believe.
Now, we've covered Christian nationalism quite a bit in our April paper, the front page being Christian Nationalism and Natural Law, a great article by Stephen Cox. Now, the discourse on Christian nationalism has largely come about because of some of the egregious things we've been seeing across the country. And the next clip I'm going to show you, Brian McCall and I, in a weekly news roundup episode, talked about the worship of Satan in the state capitol itself. Well, in the Iowa State Capitol, this notorious group, the so-called Satanic Temple, which should be mentioned, these people really aren't religious in any sort of way. They're mainly a political group bent on antagonizing Christians and trying to establish more liberal ideology, pro-abortion, pro-gay marriage, etc. So what happens? They set up this terrible-looking Baphomet statue in the middle of the Iowa State Capitol. They've got candles around it. They've got a pentagram, and this is in the middle of the Capitol as a religious exhibit. What they'll say, and this has been going on, since the 60s, the groups like this saying, well, if the nativity scene is going to be allowed in the Capitol, this should too. And so what happens? Well, being in Iowa, it's relatively conservative. So one of the state representatives was asked about this, a state representative, John Dunwell, and he is a so-called pastor of a Baptist church, and he says, my observation as a follower of Christ, I certainly find a display of the Satanic Temple objectionable. It stands in direct opposition to my faith and would be classified as evil. But then he goes on and says, I don't want the state evaluating and making determinations about religions. I am guided by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So he says, I'm not going to do anything about this. They have a right to do this under the First Amendment. Further, the Governor Reynolds of Iowa said, she says, I find the Satanic Temple display in the Capitol absolutely objectionable. But then she goes on to say, in a free society, the best response to objectionable speech is more speech, and I encourage all those of faith to join me today in praying over the Capitol and recognizing the nativity scene that will be on display. This is not foreign if you're familiar with liberalism. You'll hear this even in Locke, because the objection is obviously, well, what happens when you get a Satanist, when you get somebody that has speech that is profane and against Christ? And the objection is, well, but just having more speech, truth will triumph with more speech. And this is not true, because we need to radically say, no, error has no rights. Just because your human dignity does not necessarily give you the fundamental right to worship Satan. Now, this has been mentioned to both of these people, and they'll constantly say, well, what do you want to do? Convert them forcibly with the sword? Not necessarily. But what we do need to say is that you don't have the right to this sort of public worship of the devil. This should be very straightforward to conservatives. And again, we need to ask, what exactly is the Republican Party trying to conserve? Because right now, all they're conserving is Satanism. So it's absolutely despicable that this is going on over there. What do you think about this whole situation, Brian?
Well, you're right. You mentioned liberty, the God that fails. And
Mhm.
essentially what Chris explains in that book is this is the problem with the Lockean idea of liberalism, of the that's embodied in many ways in the US Constitution, that it sort of puts forward these principles that are really not Catholic and not workable. And this is one of them that we're seeing. Then again, they always run to that. Oh, what do you want to do? Forcibly convert them with the threat of death? Well, no, there's a big difference between forcibly converting people and saying, you don't have a right to stick that in the public capital, in
Right.
the
Yeah.
public space of our state. There's a huge difference between that. And just because you say, no, you don't have a right to put the devil in the capital, doesn't mean you're going to be going around, rounding people up and doing horrible totalitarian things at all. But
Mhm.
that's the liberalism tries to sort of to do that. But it's funny. It also reminded me of a really funny episode. So back in 2014, I think it was, this one of these groups was having a black mass in Oklahoma City in a public building the city let them use. So we organized a mass of reparation to happen at downtown to make reparation for this public sin. And Father Daniel Thiemann was the celebrant of the mass. And after the mass, there was a little small press conference where the press were there.
Mhm.
And he had a brilliant way of dealing with this, because the reporter said, well, the First Amendment guarantees your right to have this religious service you just had. Shouldn't
Mhm.
these people have a right to their religion? And he said, it
Mhm.
was brilliant. Well, they don't have a religion. They're not practicing a religion.
True.
What do you mean?
Right.
What do you mean? And he said, by definition, he said, a religion is the worship of God. By their own definition, they're not worshiping God. That
Mhm.
if you actually said you're worshiping God, they would say we're not doing that. So he said, whatever they're doing, it's not a religion. And it
Yep.
was just funny because the reporters just didn't know what to say. They were like, well, does not compute, don't understand.
Yep.
We'll just move on. So it's sort
Yep.
of funny. That's sort of how sort of weird things have become, that people can't even understand. The devil wants himself to be worshipped in opposition to God, that and therefore you're not actually practicing a religion.
Yep.
But
And I think something also to point out here is that the founding fathers, and they had a lot of problematic
well,
ideas,
yeah.
right? We know it's well known. Many of those men were Freemasons and were infected with this liberalism from Locke. But all of these men, for the most part, were operating under the presupposition that America was going to be a Christian country. Because everybody around them was a Christian. An example I'll give, because I hear this all the time. Well, these men weren't religious. Well, a man named Thomas Paine, a fellow founding father of them, he wrote a book called The Age of Reason, and this book was a tract against Christianity, widely condemned among the founding fathers, as saying, well, this is a threat to America because you're trying to condemn Christianity. So this has been, we do have some people today, something I wanted to mention in connection with this story. We do have some people, Protestants in particular, who have started this Christian nationalist movement, which is, you talk about an undefined term. That's another
Right.
one of these. Nobody knows what that is really. But a positive thing has happened in the state of Oklahoma, which is
Hmm.
Dusty Devers has recently won an election over there as a state representative. He is a Baptist pastor. So, of course, we're not going to agree with him on everything. But it's notable to say he is wanting to ban pornography, and he's wanting to ban no-fault divorce. And he's actively saying, look, America needs to be based on Christian values. So we need more of that and less of this other pastor in Iowa who, again, is a supposed pastor saying that we need to defend statues of the devil in state capitals. I like more of what Dusty Devers is saying, less of what Dunwell is saying.
Right. No, that's very, very true. But it is actually inevitable that
Yep.
liberalism, if the church wants to use it to protect herself, which is again the deal I think that John Courtney Murray sold at Vatican II. Let's
Yeah.
embrace the principles of liberalism to protect the church, that it will always
Mhm.
actually turn on the church. And that's another point Chris makes in his book. Um,
Yep.
John Locke, in his quote essay on toleration, says all religious beliefs should be tolerated except the Catholics.
Right.
So, and he sort of says that's where liberalism is always going to end. That
Yep.
it's you can't just say, well, we'll just embrace it to protect Catholicism because they're going to turn
No,
on you
doesn't
as.
work.
Yeah.
Now, of course, Christian nationalism, as it is called, is not the only approach that traditional Catholics take for applying Catholicism in the political sphere. In this next clip, I talk with Charles Colomb about some of the different variants of monarchism and which ones he best identifies with.
I mean, I like to say that when you look at American monarchists, they generally come in four different varieties.
Mm-hmm.
The first are what I would call philosophical monarchists.
Yeah.
These are people who are not particularly attached to any given dynasty, but they know their Johnson and their Burke, and they to say nothing of their Aquinas and their Aristotle,
Mm-hmm.
and so they know that monarchy per se is a superior form of government. So that's one kind. The second are what I would call religious monarchists. These are Catholics, Orthodox, Anglicans, Lutherans, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, who simply believe that their faith is most in accord with monarchy, as opposed to any other form of government. The third are emigres or their descendants, people who, like my parents, who have lingering loyalties to past dynasties in the countries from whence they came. And lastly, though not leastly, are the Anglophiles.
Yeah.
And these are folks who range all the way from dear sweet old ladies who really love their coronation china to and faithful PBS watchers, to all the way to people who really know what the system is about and think that it works better than ours does. Now, mind you, that was easier to maintain 20 or 30 years ago than it is today. Because one of the great things about living today is that every existing system is turned to garbage, and that's beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a level playing field.
True.
If it's all crap, what's not to like? And of course, in days gone by, people would accuse me of the equivalent of LARPing.
Yeah, of course.
My response today is that if you think you can get anything better than what we have now through any way at all, you're the LARPer.
Yeah.
Eat your sewage and have a good time with it.
Yeah, it's true. It happens all. You see that accusation with everything nowadays. You see it with anytime someone wants to make any sort of change, it's immediate. Well, you're just LARPing, which for anyone that doesn't know that term, it means live action role playing. It means you're not really sincere in what you're doing. You're sort of just pretending. Yeah, and it's an absurd accusation. Which one of those four would you say you identify most with? What's your primary identity, if you will, as a monarchist?
All at once.
What an answer, right? That's great.
I suppose I'm weakest in the Anglophilia department, to be honest.
This last clip should give everyone a little bit of hope when it comes to U.S. politics. CFN's editor-in-chief Brian McCall got to interview Paul Giesecke, a candidate for U.S. Senate from the state of Washington, about what he thinks needs to be done for U.S. politics to get better.
We're all at a breaking point for different things right now. And I think there's a huge turning point in society right now. And I think the responsibility lies with Catholics more than anyone else. The reason why is because Our Lady promised us that her Immaculate Heart will triumph. We know this. Joe Biden is never going to say that, but we know this. So what do? We're responsible to lay out the red carpet for her. And that's what I'm trying to do. And I hope other Catholics do as well, is that we can kind of get our message out there, whether it's in politics or any other area of life. But we really need to start laying the groundwork, roll out that red carpet. So when we have the triumph of the Immaculate Heart, those seeds will be planted, because heaven does demand that we do our part. We shouldn't sit idle and keep our religion and our beliefs to ourselves. We need to proclaim the glory of God. And we really need to stop separating everything we do in life, especially when it comes to politics. You shouldn't just leave leave your religion at the door and go on with your life. No, you take it everywhere with you. And I think that we can do a better job doing that. And, I'm personally guilty myself for doing that sometimes, but I think we can all try better. And I think us just knowing, one, we have great popes, great saints that we can look back to have examples on how to lead our lives, not just personally, but as societies, right? We don't just live by ourselves, but we live among a nation of people, and we have the best resources. So I think Catholics really need to lead the charge on almost every aspect of our society, but especially in politics, just because of how critical it is now.